say a fond hello. Today, fond memories of traveling into that elusive area called the Twilight Zone. Fond memories of watching black and white television. Everybody wants to meet Arlen Schumer, including our good friend Bob Chevy and Ron Elleron and Richie Ornstein, and also our premier problem solver today, Dr. D. A little bit of what we call memorabilia. Who was the #1 cover boy of 1942, 41, 43? His name was Mickey Rooney, the life and loves of box office man #1. You're watching show #1, the big edition of our Red Hot Party. It starts like this. Don't ever leave us. Be right back.
9 Broadcast Plaza is making headlines. Page 6 of the New York Post says it was such bizarre TV, some viewers wondered.
Okay, prior to asking Ron Elleron and Bob Chevy and Richie Ornstein to join my discussion, I must begin by asking Arlen Schumer for his description or your definition of the Twilight Zone. How would you sort of describe that world or that lifestyle, that phrase Twilight Zone?
I can only describe it as Rod Serling described it. It's the dimension of imagination.
Dimension of imagination.
That's exactly what it is.
This is a gorgeous book, a rave review in the Times, an endless rave, and coffee table size, right? And soft cover, too.
Soft cover as well, right. But the hardcover people should look for a little bit harder, but it's available.
You have been a longtime fan of Twilight Zone.
Yes.
How passionate a cult following does a series... we're talking about the old black and white one, right?
Of course. That's the only one as far as I'm concerned.
Well, the one on before us is great, too,
the
color version. What year were they made about, the color version? The
1985 to 89 or so.
Right. And yours was made...
59 to 64.
1959 to 1964. And did some amateurish type actors come out of that series that became pillars of Hollywood society? Name a few who might have broken in with
Robert Redford, Charles Bronson. They're probably the 2 most famous movie stars that later went on. But the directors, some of them like Richard Donner went on to direct feature films, Buzz Kulick, Lamont Johnson. And the actors, the writers, it's like a who's who of Hollywood.
And I began to ask you, how passionate, Arlen, a cult following do some of those early episodes have? I mean, you hear about Star Trekkies. I mean, in terms of Twilight Zone clubs or conventions or newsletters, or are you the only one in the...
Well, the interesting thing about the Twilight Zone is while it's entered the American vernacular, it doesn't have the same type of trivial background that all these other famous television shows like Star Trek and Mary Tyler Moore have. There was no continuing actors except for Serling himself, and the only continuing thing was the concept. Yet, the concept has entered the American consciousness to the point where everybody hums the theme when something strange happens to them. Everybody remembers maybe a favorite episode, but that's about it. So what I tried to do was say, well, if a show like this has entered the American consciousness, what is it about those shows that did it? It had to come down to the images and the ideas. And that's what I tried to put my finger on, is just what were the great Twilight Zone images and what were the great Twilight Zone ideas, the philosophical visions and the television images.
And why do I have the feeling that Twilight Zone, the episodes that you love especially, have been given kind of short shrift when historians write about early day TV? Why do they tend to leave out Twilight Zone so
Because it's the anti-Hollywood concept. It can't be described in only one sentence. So they basically say, oh, the Twilight Zone, yeah, that was a really good show. But in my opinion, the level of quality of the show all across the board ensures that I think as we reach the 21st century, it's the Twilight Zone that should be considered the greatest American television series of the century.
Because I've always had the feeling in those days when TV was classified as kind of an intellectual wilderness, this was one of the few oases in that desert. It was so refreshing, so great.
Yet it never had high ratings. It had a revolving door of sponsors. It was the prestige intellectual show of the day, and just like shows like Star Trek, they were yanked off the air because of low ratings. People wrote letters. In fact, one of the writers, the late Charles Beaumont, knew that there was a core following of young people, and he said maybe it's because young people are inclined to let loose the full play of the imagination, while older people are inclined to fear it. And that's, I think, what happened with Twilight Zone, was that if you were young and watching those shows in the early 60s, you were being shown things about racism and about the individual and about standing against conformity.
Maybe that predated the whole psychedelic era, too.
Totally.
Really?
Totally. I'd like to think that if you were 10 years old and being shown that there doesn't have to be racism,
Right.
that things can be different. The Twilight Zone was a what-if show.
What if
the world was different? Then I think if you were 18 years old in 1968, you were taking part in social change and you were marching against the war. And that's the unacknowledged influence that Serling and the other Twilight Zone writers should be acknowledged for.
What gave Rod Serling such an eerie, horrific slant on life that he was so Twilight Zone-ish? He was just inspired. Everything had to go into the Twilight Zone.
The reason why was because in the 50s, when
Right.
he was the Emmy-winning live television playwright,
Right.
he had the hardest time in the world with the censors. In those days, the censors had so much creative control that in today's terms, it would be ludicrous if you heard some of the stories. So at one point, he did a play called The Arena for live television,
Right.
dealing with the Senate.
I remember that.
And afterwards, it was so mangled by the censors, he said that I would have had a more successful drama if I had peopled the Senate with robots instead of Democrats, Republicans. So what happened was he was able to take some of the ideas and by clothing them in fantasy and illusion in the Twilight Zone, he was able to get it past the censors because to them, Rod Serling was just this weird guy doing stuff in the Twilight Zone. But really, those great Twilight Zone episodes dealt with the same themes that he tried to get across in the 50s.
From that moment on that you mentioned, all of his visions, all of his inspirations were directed at that Twilight Zone.
Yes.
This man has written a Who's the publisher?
Chronicle Books in San Francisco.
I want to show a picture or two. This man's written a fantastic book called The Twilight Zone, Visions from the Twilight Zone. Maybe we'll show a few things. I want to bring in a few of my friends who want to meet you. Bob Chevy is America's third or fourth busiest band leader. This man must employ about 400 musicians every week. And so records haven't put you out of business. We still have some live music somewhere, right, Bob?
No, live music is the way to go, and that's
Right.
what we're pushing, live music.
Bob, what's keeping you busiest? Then I want to hear about Twilight Zone. And you?
Well, besides Twilight Zone, I've looked at that book. That's a great book. You know,
Right.
it's written like a television show.
Right.
When you're going to open up that book, you're going to see, it looks like you're looking at television.
See what a good plugger you got here? He wants you to open up the book and pick out any page, any page.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, I'll
you
tell
wanna
you
do
the
it? Oh, you
page
do it.
that I like.
All right.
I really just picked it out.
Right.
And the best show that I remember, I know everybody out there remembers a show from Twilight Zone. If you say, what's your favorite show? And the show that I liked was the show where the girl wanted to be beautiful. And she kept going through 11 operations and everything else. And then they finally took off her bandages. And she was beautiful by our standards, but she wasn't beautiful by society because everybody in society looked like this.
Hold it up like that. Wow.
And she is Donna Douglas from the Beverly Hillbillies, but a year before the Beverly Hillbillies went on the air.
Yeah, but you see, here's what happens with this. It gives you, I'm plugging your book. I'm supposed to be plugging me.
No, just
I'm
hold the
supposed
book.
to be
Just-
plugging me.
just
The
hold the
fact
book.
that I'm a great band leader, a great entertainer, that I often appear with Merv Griffin in resorts in Atlantic City with the greatest of CEOs down there, Mr. Dave Hanlon, who was so fantastic. I'm not even mentioning that. I mentioned
Are
in your
these,
book.
let me hold this up myself. Are these
It says
Twilight...
beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Hand it to me. Are these Twilight Zone... Hand me the book. Are these Twilight Zone episodes, Arlen, as relevant now as in the 1960s, would you say? Some of them?
I think so, because
Really?
I think Serling and the other writers, they put their finger on very basic what I call post-war American fears. The fear of being locked in a department store at night. Just the basic thing about the Twilight Zone was confronting your reality, whether it was your internal reality, things about yourself, or confronting the external reality, things about the world. And those things will never go out of style.
This is a tribute to... You finished that sentence. A tribute to... This book is a salute to what?
To black and white, great black and white television photography.
And you can see the follow-up every night preceding us at about 1 o'clock in the morning on Channel 9.
Twilight Zone still lives right now in the Middle East, as far as I'm concerned.
Definitely.
Things that keep changing, concepts changing every minute. And the last war and what Israel is going through is really some heavy Twilight Zone trip.
You can say that again.
Yeah.
You can definitely. Now, one of the reasons I wanted Bob Chevy to meet Ron Elleron. Ron is one of my very favorite singers. We introduced him the other night as the international superstar, megastar, which he is. He's got more gold albums than we've got gold teeth. You know what I'm saying? but what I want to do is, if he's ever free on a night when you're organizing one of your packages, Bob,
Oh, yeah.
Right.
I was, you know what he was doing that was so good?
Right.
I love this. He was singing Yellow Ribbon in Hebrew.
In Hebrew, yes.
Hebrew.
I learned the
Give us
song.
a teeny weeny, a teeny
Yeah,
weeny.
I learned the song from the Patriot soldiers in Israel, and I translated it into Hebrew.
An itsy bitsy, please.
אני חוזר אלייך שוב, נמאס להיות רווק, להיות עצוב. 1000 מכתבים שלחתי, 1000 נשיקות, ואם עדיין את שלי, תדעי מה לעשות, תדעי מה לעשות. Try a yellow ribbon round the old, and etc., etc.
I love it, love it. Let's get a comment from Richie Ornstein. What do you want to say about the zone or about the singer?
Well, I know Tony Orlando is definitely going to be envious of this man. and Arlen, I wanted to ask you about the background music. How instrumental do you feel that was in the success of that show with the theme song and everything else? I think the Dead do it now. I don't know who did it previous.
I think, in addition to Rod Serling's voice, it's, of course, the classic theme song that everybody remembers. Interesting thing about the theme song, Marius Constant, French composer, composed that as an answer to a contest that the Twilight Zone producer, like 1960-61, did in Europe. He wrote it, he got $200 for it, stayed in Europe the next 25 years, came to this country in 1985 to work on an opera. He's sitting there having dinner with a bunch of the young cast, and they asked him what else had he written. And Marius Constant goes, well, about 25 years ago, I wrote a theme song for an old television show, maybe you know it, The Twilight Zone. Well, as Marius Constant tells it, they were floored. It was as if he had written Beethoven's Ninth. And he just said, isn't it funny that for $200 in answer to a contest, he's written something that has entered the American vernacular.
Schumer, what would Rod Serling say, or how might he say it if he were here right now? How would he...
How would he say?
Yeah.
I just think that I'm keeping his spirit alive. I think that he died way too young.
How about one of your voices? One of your impressions of any of these Twilight Zone people? Rod or anybody?
Well, I could do a pretty good Rod Serling.
Try one. Why not? Why not? Since you live it and breathe it, you're into it. Why not?
I don't have my smoking cigarette.
We'll pretend.
There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Joe Franklin Show.
Terrific.
Very good.
What can I tell you? What can I tell
The
you?
no smoking zone. No, I'll tell you one thing. I met this man in the street one time. Did I encourage you to write this book, right? Remember that?
About 5 years ago, I'm walking along the street in the city, and I run into Joe, and I've been working on this book for about 10 years, and I said to Joe that, Joe, if I ever get this book published, I would love to be on your show. And he said, go for it, and he said, definitely give me a call. Here we are 5 years later.
How about naming your favorite Twilight Zone episode ever out of all the black and whites? The one...
Well, I think just like Bob said,
the one he said?
I, the Beholder. The other great episode is one that Richard Matheson wrote, which I think we can all identify with. Businessman walks into his office, picks up the phone to make a phone call. The phone is dead. He hears somebody yell, cut. He spins around in his chair, and his life has become a movie set. And I think that's something that we, again, in the psychedelic era, everybody said, wow, man, isn't life like a movie? But that's something that gets to the very heart of what the Twilight Zone was, that do we control our lives, or are our lives controlled for us? Are we living a script, or do we write our own script?
You know what I think? This book is going to be on 1 million tables. It's going to be
I hope so.
big seller. It's written by Arlen Schumer, and he's a gifted man. And local boy made good, right?
You got it.
We shall return with Dr. D, and more surprises follow. These words, let's watch closely.